In this video, I'm going to talk about official and informal notation, which involves parentheses. So remember that P arrow Q is not a sentence, and that's because it's missing parentheses. And we need parentheses to avoid ambiguity. Just to see that point, consider these two sentences. So the first of those is it's a conditional. The negation is in the antecedent applied just to the P. The second is a negation. It's the negation of a conditional. And so these say different things. One says that not P is enough for Q. The other says that P isn't enough for Q. And those are independent of one another. It might be that nothing is enough for Q, and so it's not the negation of P or Q is true, but it's not true that not P is enough for Q because nothing's enough for Q. So the right could be true and the left be false, for example. So the parentheses tell us which logical symbol is the main connective. And so we do need parentheses. The parentheses tell us that on the right, the one on the right, that first we added an arrow between P and Q, and in adding that arrow we put parentheses around the whole thing, and then we added the negation. On the other hand, on the left side we see that the parentheses are around the whole thing, and that means that we put an arrow in between them and then put sentences on both sides of the arrow, and so the not is attached to just the P and is in the antecedent. So if we were to drop all the parentheses from our language, then we would have an ambiguous language. So in that language, negation P arrow Q, we wouldn't know, is that conditional with the negation in its antecedent, or is that the negation of the whole conditional? Without parentheses, there'd be nothing to tell us. Relatedly, this string of symbols, negation P arrow Q, is not, according to the rules, a sentence. Those two things are sentences. Whenever you have a two-place connective, the arrow, the double arrow, the conjunction, or the disjunction, you have to have a pair of parentheses to go with it. And negation P arrow Q doesn't have that pair of parentheses, so it's not a sentence. But we're still going to allow ourselves to drop parentheses when we don't need them. And we're going to say that when we do drop parentheses according to certain rules, then the thing we get is, it's not official notation, but it is informal notation. So this, P arrow Q, it's not official notation because it's not a sentence according to the rules, but we're going to say it is a sentence of informal notation. Our first rule says that you can drop the final set of parentheses if they're external. So for example, when you have parentheses around so you have parenthesis, negation, P arrow Q, parenthesis. So those parentheses they're all the way on the outside, they were added last, so they're final and external, and so this convention says those you can drop. And so when you see negation P arrow Q, you know, oh, that's a conditional with a negation in its antecedent because it was produced. We got the sentence without the parentheses by dropping the final external set of parentheses. The second rule says you can drop parentheses from around a conjunction or disjunction when the conjunction or disjunction is immediately inside of an arrow or a double arrow. So for example, we might start with the conditional whose consequences are and whose antecedent is P and Q, and we have two sets of parentheses, one going with the conditional and one going with the conjunction. So we can drop the first external set of parentheses, which go with the conditional, from our first rule. And when we do that, we get the second sentence here, where we still have the parentheses around the conjunction, but the parentheses around the whole thing are gone. And then we drop the parentheses around the conjunction using this second rule, and now we have P and Q arrow R with no parentheses, but we know that's a conditional whose antecedent is a conjunction because it was produced in this way. You can do the same thing again with a biconditional and a disjunction. So in this case, we have the disjunction on the right side of the biconditional. We drop the external parentheses, and then we drop the parentheses around the disjunction as well. And we have P double arrow Q or R, and we know that's a biconditional whose right side is a disjunction. The last rule says if you have a string of conjunctions or a string of conjunctions, and they're grouped to the left, then you can drop the leftmost parentheses. So here's an example. We have parenthesis, parenthesis, P and Q, parenthesis, and R, parenthesis. So first we drop the external set again, but we still have the parentheses around the P and Q on the left. So this rule says you can drop those. And you can do the same thing if they're all disjunctions. If the parentheses were elsewhere, or if it was mixing conjunctions and disjunctions, then you couldn't drop the parentheses here. And mostly the computer program will be doing this for you in the derivations module, but it's good to know what rules it's following in dropping parentheses. So one more piece of terminology, a string. A string is just some symbols. A string of symbols is just some symbols. So P arrow Q, that's a string. Arrow negation Z, that's a string. Negation parenthesis Z arrow QR parenthesis, that's a string. None of these are in official notation, and only the first one is in formal notation. The other two are not sentences at all. So we have three categories in our grammar. First, we have three ways a string of symbols might be. A string might be a sentence in official notation. And how do you get to be official notation? The 4 rules have to tell you that you are. The rules from the previous video that say either your sentence letter or your negation attached to a sentence, or your 2 sentences with one of the symbols in the middle and parentheses around the outside. A sentence is in informal notation if you could first build up an official notation sentence and then by dropping parentheses get the thing you actually have in front of you. So informal notation is we took a sentence and we dropped some parentheses and got what we have. And then lastly, we say that a sentence is not well formed if it's not in any of those categories. If it's not official and it's not informal, then it's not well formed. So those are the 3 categories for our grammar. In the next video, I'm going to talk about parsing, which is applying these rules and categories to some strings. And that's a module in the program, and so you'll be doing some homework problems in it. You'll find them to be very straightforward, but I will talk about them in the next video.